Why not?
Yeah, I hope people will appreciate that when you provide military advice, you do so in good faith. And at the end of the day, when you're in uniform and you're inside the Department of Defense, you provide military advice, and then our civilian leadership, as it should be, makes a decision. So the day Secretary Carter made a decision, I had but one task, which was to, with full commitment, implement the decision that Secretary Carter made and to make sure that the command climate that was set from our most senior leaders all the way down to the squad leaders was an effective command climate to implement that decision. I also want to tell you that when I made the recommendation to Secretary Carter, it wasn't a I don't recommend women be integrated. First of all, even as a commandant in the Marine Corps, I opened up all but 2% of the occupational fields in the Marine Corps as my recommendation. And with those fields that I did not recommend, I outlined the specific conditions that I thought should be set before we move forward with full integration. So it was a question of, Mr. Secretary, we've done some very careful analytic work. We've done some experimentation. Here's the issues that should be considered when we go to full integration. And my recommendation is we address these issues before we integrate. In a conversation, he said, okay, that's fine. I understand your perspective. I believe that we can address the issues. He said, I accept the issues that you've raised. And by the way, if you look at the memo that Secretary Carter signed out to implement the decision, every single issue that is in the letter that I sent to him is reflected in Secretary Carter's implementation memo. And he said, okay, General, I got it, but here's what I believe. I believe the issues that you've raised can be addressed in implementation, and this process doesn't have to be sequential. I said, I got it, yes, sir, and we've been off. And so I haven't thought about anything other than executing the Secretary's decision since that day, and that's the way it ought to be.
Along those lines, Mr. Chairman, there are thousands of transgender service members who are honorably serving in the military today. Last year, then Secretary Carter created the new policy allowing transgender individuals to openly serve and allow new transgender recruits to join. Why is the Pentagon considering changing this policy?
Okay, first of all, let's be clear. The transgender personnel are serving right now, and there's no review ongoing that would affect the ability of those currently serving to continue serving, provided they can meet the physical and mental qualifications of service, be worldwide deployable, and the same standards that every other soldier, sailor, airman, and Marine meets. The issue now is the challenges of assessing individuals and the criteria for assessing. And so there have been some issues raised with regard to challenges of assessing transgender individuals, and that's what the Secretary is reviewing. So this is not a reversal of the policy that was implemented before. This is the next phase of implementation was accessions, and there have been some issues identified with accessions that, the service chiefs, some of the service chiefs believe need to be resolved before we move forward. And so that's where we are right now.
The Joint Strike Fighter is entering service, but with many cost overruns and delays. Will it continue as a program, or is it too expensive to maintain?
Well, that's a pretty loaded question, and someone has an agenda in the way that they phrase that question. But first of all, the F-35 is operationally deployed today, so it will remain as a program. And the initial operating capability in the Marine Corps was made before I changed jobs in July of 2015. I had sufficient confidence in the F-35 to declare it initially operational capable and declare that first squadron capable of worldwide deployment, and it subsequently has deployed. We also, you will see in the budget, have a significant buy of F-35s in the budget this year, and would expect that to continue in the future. The challenges associated with the F-35, whether they be engineering or cost overruns, I would argue are not anomalous to many, many other programs that we have had inside the Department of Defense. And frankly, the cost overruns, a bit of that is history, because over the past 18 to 24 months, I think most people would argue, and Congress certainly, I think, supports this perspective, that the program manager has done a great job of getting a lot of those cost overruns back in check, and the cost of the aircraft and the operation and sustainment cost also in check. So the short answer is the F-35 is a critical program. I believe it's not a better F-18 or a better bomb truck, fourth generation, but it's a transformational capability. both its ability to deliver ordnance as well as its ability to serve literally as a server in the sky is going to transform the way we fight. And I think we fully haven't appreciated all the things it's going to do to change our warfighting concepts.
With the proliferation of quote-unquote lone wolf actors of terror, what steps are being taken by the U.S. military to prevent Osama bin Laden's grown son from perpetuating terror strictly in the U.S.?
Okay, those seem to me to be two separate issues, right?
Yes.
Lone wolf in the United States, and then Osama bin Laden's son. Earlier, I spoke about this this network for intelligence and information sharing. So, to the latter question, making sure that we have a common intelligence picture, common operational picture. That is, that we have a common understanding with all the nations that are affected by extremism is a critical part to keep those individuals from being able to plan and conduct external operations, which is job number one for us in the counterterrorism fight, is to prevent attacks on the United States or on our allies and partners. With regard to lone wolf attacks, we are in support of local and federal law enforcement officials, and so if you talk about lone wolf U.S. citizens inspired by propaganda, the military dimension of that problem is battlefield success that undermines the credibility of the narrative, even as local law enforcement and so forth deal with individual U.S. citizens who may be inspired to commit acts of violence.
We're running short on time, so I'm going to one more substance question, and then I'm going to give you our traditional mug. What can be done to stem the flow of refugees in the Mediterranean Sea and human suffering? Should refugee centers be built in North Africa and other areas to provide safe havens for those fleeing violence and famine? And what roles should NGO or groups like the Vatican play?
Yeah, let me answer that question, at least in my lane. And I would argue a lot of times when we look at violent extremism, we focus on the risk of attacks, and we should. The tragic loss of life associated with violent extremism is a big issue. But if you think about it, probably the most significant effect of violent extremism has been the flow of refugees. Certainly the impact it's had in Europe from a political perspective, and then just the sheer human suffering that's taken place as a result of 10 million people, just in the case of Syria, that have been dislocated or have become refugees. About half have become refugees, half have been dislocated inside of Syria. So it's a tragic outcome of violent extremism. I think the military dimension of that particular problem is working with local partners to create the conditions where people can be safe at home and don't have the need to go and become refugees. And obviously we can also support in providing some immediate support in the form of water supplies and food, in making sure that the conditions are conducive to non-governmental organizations or in the case of USAID or government organizations to be able to provide that kind of support. But we work very closely with USAID, particularly in stabilization of places like Mosul and Raqqa. And I can tell you, when we sit down and develop a campaign plan for Raqqa and Mosul, sitting at the table is USAID to make sure that we can go into stabilization immediately after hostilities cease and set conditions as quickly as possible to relieve some of the human suffering.
Before I ask the last question, I'm going to present our traditional National Press Club mug. And Mr. Chairman, your picture will go on the wall outside with the rest of the historic speakers that have been coming here since we started the speakers program in 1920. Last question goes back to Syria.
Wait a minute.
Last question. I said one before. There's one last one.
All right.
Can you expand upon your plans after ISIL is defeated? That's an optimistic question. You say that does it become a safe zone? Are you prepared to protect it from aerial attack? And is there a no-fly zone? And are you then planning to expand that zone? Okay,
I think it's probably, if you don't mind, I'm going to answer a different question. I mean, we'll certainly, no, I mean, I'll answer the Raqqa piece, but there's a broader question, which is what about after ISIS? So after ISIS and Raqqa, I mentioned earlier, we're working now with the State Department to make sure there's effective governance there, make sure there's local forces that are recruited to provide security inside of Raqqa, and that's our plan for Raqqa. But what I would tell you is that violent extremism is not over with ISIS. And that's why, in fact, one of the reasons why I'm running now at 1330 is we have 1:30. We have all of our combatant commanders and service chiefs together here in about 30 minutes for a quarterly review of where we are in dealing with violent extremism, and very much looking towards long-term framework for our operations. Again, I talked earlier about politically, fiscally, and militarily sustainable, with an assumption that this is a long-term fight, and making sure that we constantly review our organizational construct, making sure we constantly review our intelligence sharing relationships, making sure we constantly review the success of our partners on the ground and what additional support they need is all part of what we're trying to do. But this is a long-term fight, and so Raqqa is tactical. Mosul is tactical. I believe it'll have strategic effects on the overall messaging, because it certainly undermines the credibility that there's a physical caliphate that exists in the Middle East when they lose Raqqa and Mosul. But we ought not to confuse success in Raqqa and Mosul as something that means it's the end of the fight. I think we should all be braced for a long fight, and that's why we so emphasize making sure that we have the broadest network possible of partners to help deal with this challenge, because it's not about just the United States. It's about the 120 plus countries from which foreign fighters have come just to Iraq and Syria. And to the degree that we can get all 120 of those countries, or as many of them as possible, to cooperate in intelligence sharing, information sharing, and effective action, limit the freedom of movement of foreign fighters, limit their ability to share resources, and erode the effectiveness of their narrative, that will be successful. But again, we're prepared for a long-term fight and a constant review of how we're addressing it. If there's one thing I would leave you with, don't ever think that those of us in uniform are complacent about any of the issues that we're spoken about today. In fact, I tell people that, when I was a second lieutenant, my level of experience arguably was way down here, but my level of confidence that I had all the answers was way up here. And as I speak to you today, my level of experience is arguably way up here, and my level of confidence on the issues that we're dealing with that I have all the answers is way down here. These are extraordinarily complex, if not wicked, problems we're dealing with, and beware of those with too much confidence that they have all the answers. Thank you.
Thank you. I ask you stay in your seats as the chairman leaves the hall. For more information on our programs, you can log into www.press.org. We are adjourned. Thank you.